welcome to this week's episode of the Marina Perry Podcast. I am, of course, your host, Marina, and today I have my good friend, Rudi Landmann, who is a long-term growth worker, actually, and we have, over the years, through different programs, coaching situations, and just life, really been on a journey together. But what I'm excited about for you today is that Rudi has come on the show with the intention of sharing his story, and it's a very unique story, and even actually what I just used there as a pronoun, accidentally, already in the intro, kind of points to the story. And so what I would love you to know about this story is it will be different perhaps from yours, but the beautiful pearl of wisdom is that sometimes we can start a journey thinking we know what we want. And then when we get there, we find out it's actually not at all what we want. In fact, it can be a huge surprise. And so Rudi is going to share their story, and in doing so, kind of give us all a little bit of courage to start a journey and to meet ourselves when we find ourselves perhaps in an unknown place. So get excited. And Rudi, thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Thank you, Marina. It's lovely to be here.
And so, of course, we always start the episode with what is the animal that best represents your personality, your way of being?
Easy for me. I'm a parrot.
A parrot! Oh, I love that. No, these are all hummingbirds on the back here. Parrot. And why, Rudi?
So I actually have some pet parrots, but they're just so joyful. They're colourful. They're smart, they're inquisitive, they're very affectionate. So, I love to have a bird sitting on my shoulder and just preening away. And so I just love them. They're over the top, they're flamboyant, and I think they just embody most of my values.
They are very majestic creatures, particularly the super colourful, I would call them tropical parrots. I'm not really a bird person, don't know much about the difference between them, but I do love some birds. So, Rudi, what would be the superpower that you would choose to have if you could have any at all?
I think if I could choose any superpower, it would just to be the ability to really see deep inside somebody very quickly. So I do think of myself as being pretty empathic, but I would just want to up-level those skills and just be able to reach that human connection very quickly.
That's an interesting one. I don't know that I've heard it worded quite that way. I like it. So, Rudi, thank you for coming on the show today. And you and I, as I mentioned in the intro, we have a history together. We've known each other for several years, in and out of.
Think of how long ago.
Yeah, it's like the health club, and then we've done different growth work together over the years, and it has been truly one of my great privileges to witness your journey, and it has been a unique one. And I still actually would probably put in, if I had a top list of particularly one-on-one client experiences and awarenesses and ahas, some of yours and your willingness to kind of unearth codes and what's there, they would be in my top ranking experiences. And I've coached some amazing humans and who have had amazing ahas. So I'm really excited about this podcast, and I would love you to just, wherever feels right, start somewhere. Tell everyone who you are, how you got to be where you are, and what's happening.
Okay. So, I was trying to think just before, like how long it has been for us, and it's got to be 6-ish years by now, so it's quite a long time. And of course, we first came into contact through health clubs because I was on a process even then of transforming my life, so I'm a bit of a serial transformer. And maybe to tell that story, going back to that kind of point. So I was at a stage in my life where I've been working in the tech industry for a very long time. And I guess like a lot of stereotypical IT workers, I was not moving very much and eating a steady diet of junk food. And so I can't maybe even overemphasize that, because it was like a completely sedentary existence. All of my work, all of my hobbies, everything sitting at a keyboard. And then eating, I would be eating I'd be eating fast food at least 5 days a week. So I weighed 143 kilos at that point. And a bunch of things happened that kind of made me realize that I wanted to change my life. And I did. So I started on this process of starting to move, exploring different forms of movement, which is where the club was so awesome because of the wide variety, and discovering what I might like to do, starting to pay attention to how I was eating. And basically when we first met, I was kind of almost at the tail end of that process. I'd lost very nearly half my body weight, gone from completely sedentary to extremely active, and what I'd been wanting to do was the transformation, I'll say straight up, was aesthetically driven. I was unhappy with how I looked, and I wanted to be slim and trim, and I achieved that.
Yes, you did.
And I went from never having run in my life to running 3 marathons in a year, to
that's insane.
Never having ridden a bike even as a child, to riding in 100 to 160 kilometer events. So
you don't do anything but halves, do you?
No. And I'm not that fit right now, but at that peak, I was extremely lean, extremely athletic, and I had achieved exactly what I set out to achieve. And I was looking in the mirror, and I was looking at photographs, and I was no happier. It did not. I was proud of my accomplishments, absolutely. But in terms of what I'd actually set out to achieve in that process, and what I actually did achieve, and it's like, why am I still so unhappy when I look at this? So, yeah, that was a huge shock.
It can be a huge shock, I think, for people too. And I mean, it speaks to so many reasons why some people never actually achieve their goals. Let's be honest, there are people who will set goals and don't achieve them because there is this part of us that's living in the space of what I call hope. It's the most powerful emotion, as you know. And so if we don't quite get there, we can live in hope of getting there. But if we get there, the potentially worst case scenario is we get there and we realize we don't even want to be there, which is exactly what happened to you, right? Yeah. You got there and did all, and it was. And from the outside looking in, and this is the other interesting thing that I really want the listeners to pick up on, is from the outside looking in, you were crushing it. You were crushing it. Like, everyone was like, Rudi, and it's applauding. And this is a big repeating teaching point that I share, because much the same for me. Life will often applaud achievement. Life will often applaud success. Life will often applaud you getting what you said you wanted, but it doesn't lead to that inner peace, or that inner joy, or that inner state of authentic aliveness, right? And so tell us more, Rudi.
Yeah, so, and you're absolutely right, because, I went from, I went from like 143 kilos to 80 kilos, and the applause was, I mean, yes, it felt good. Sometimes it felt even a little bit awkward, because it was just like, well, I just lost a lot of weight. It's not like I cured cancer or anything. And so sometimes it felt like a bit disproportionate, and I wasn't entirely comfortable with it all the time. But yeah, so reaching that point, and then realizing, no, this isn't, why am I still not happy with this? And I think, so the first big takeaway that I took, even before I really understood what was going on, the first takeaway was realizing that, and you'll see this, lots of coaches and self-help people, and lots of people are going to say this, that, if you're not happy, then then getting that thing, whether it's the new job or the new car or the new outfit or the new body, is not going to make you happy. No,
nothing outside of you can give you the experience that you're seeking internally. They are, when in fact one projects the other, right? And this is why you're quite right. I mean, it's a truthism in personal development, yet not truly fully embodied, I don't think. It's an awareness, but not always embodied. And it is this: get clear on what you want, and get clear on the feeling that you think it's going to give you. Then practice the creation of that experience and the embodiment in your body, because you generally have a block to it, mind you, in the now. But if we can practice the embodiment of the feeling in the now, well, firstly, we may not even need the thing we thought we needed. But secondly, you'll come into probably faster, better flow alignment, and you'll magnetize it quicker because you're already in the frequency of it, right? That's how the quantum works. So you realized getting what you want externally, big lesson. I mean, I think we've all had this experience. We really want the car. We want the fancy car. We get the fancy car, and after a week, it's like, I'm not any happier. Whatever it is, we get the extra sex on the side. We get the extra increase in the paycheck. And it's this whole story of waiting to be happy. We're familiar with that. But yours gets a little more interesting.
Yeah, sure. And so in all of that, there was just this random turning point. And I think that's often how it is in life, right? Something just kind of blindsides you and you realize, okay, that's something I hadn't considered. And so one evening, I'd met up with some friends in the valley, and I was walking back to my car, and I walked past a particular activewear store that caters, it's a primarily women's brand, and in the window was this beautiful pair of tights, and I thought, oh wow, they look really cool. And I thought, oh wow, I wish I could wear something like that. And kept walking. And then a moment later, it kind of hit me. It said, why don't I? And I thought, no, that's women's clothing. I can't wear that. So, and then I couldn't keep walking because they just captivated me. People who know me well will know which brand I'm talking about.
We all know which brand.
You all know which
we
brand
know
we're
Rudi,
talking
I'm like,
about.
why are you not saying the brand?
Okay, well, it was Lorna Jane, right? And so
I think you're probably their most loyal customer, so I don't think they would mind you saying that.
No, I didn't want to do product placement on your podcast.
Okay.
So anyway, this was
unsponsored. It is not an ad. Yes, but the pants were at Lorna Jane. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I walked past the window, and then I thought, look, I need them. So I went back and I took a photo because it was at night and the store was closed. And I went home, and of course, for me it was like, and I can also order online. So, it's kind of anonymous. Nobody has to know I'm buying this. And then, of course, it was sold out online.
Oh, yes. Thank you, universe.
Right? So I could not
joke.
I could not just kind of anonymously buy these things. I would have to go into the store. So I did the research. I online. I identified the style number. I looked at the sizing charts, figured out what I probably was, and then I went into the Lorna Jane store a couple of days later and said, look, that pair of tights in the window. Do you still have that? Do you have it in an M? And they said yes, and for my wife, I said.
And just to be clear, Rudi has a wife.
Yes.
Yeah, just for the listeners. Yeah. Because as you're listening to the story unfold, you might be saying, "Oh, what's going on?" But you have a wife and children.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Very happily married for coming up on 15 years now.
Congratulations.
So, thank you. So, so I resisted all attempts at upsales, which like this, and so just got those tights and got out of there as quickly as possible. And so the other thing about me is, I'm a lifelong science and astronomy nerd. These tights had beautiful star patterns on them, and that's why they had caught my eye in the first place. And I'm also an avid park runner. So the next Saturday morning before park run, I put on the tights to get ready to go out, and I couldn't do it. And so I went back and I changed out of them, and I changed back into them. And I literally put them on and off literally 3 times before I worked up the nerve to walk out the door in women's tights. But when I arrived at parkrun, as far as I can tell, practically nobody noticed or cared or paid any attention whatsoever. Except for some of my friends, some of my women friends at the run who complimented me on them and said how great they looked. So there was literally zero, all of that fear that I'd had about, oh my God, this is so
such a big
this
step.
is such a big step.
This is such a
big deal.
wrong
And
move.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm
all
using
of that
quotation
fear.
marks if you're not watching the video. Yeah. And Rudi, so often I hear this with people. It's like, I can't do it. They're going to be so angry. Oh, they're going to judge me. Oh, they're going to... And the stories and the amount of resistance in a person's body. And I can think of one person in particular who didn't want to tell her mum something about the boyfriend. Like, they were moving in together. She's like, no, she's going to do this. She's going to do that. She's not going to accept it. She had worked herself into a full lather. And she eventually told the mother. And the mother was like, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's so much of the story of the drama is just in our head.
Exactly.
Yeah. So great. I mean, what a great. I can see the narrative unfolding in the picture, and how much you would have been like thinking everyone's going to poke, and we have childhood memories of bullying, so it's understandable. But everyone accepted it, and so that was a big turning point for you.
It was a huge turning point to realize that, and it still took a while. It wasn't like, oh, okay, one and done. It was there was there
you
was
got to
still
edge a few times, right, till the edge gets comfortable. Yeah,
that's right. But gradually that fell away and wasn't an issue. And then it wasn't long after that I had the experience of actually, I met Lorna Jane herself at an event,
and you became her
I
number
was
one
in
customer. No, just kidding. At some point that does happen, just so everyone knows. Sorry to plot spoil. Yeah,
but yeah, and I was actually, and again I was terrified, because I thought, oh no, she's just going to think I'm taking the piss, or that this is some kind of thing, and it just absolutely wasn't. And she just looked at me with this huge smile and welcomed me, and it was like,
fantastic.
So we have these, and I've been coached by you. I can it's that whole process of we predict something, and then we test it, and we're proven wrong. So, oh, okay, that belief is not true.
I call the process, one of the key ways to really, as Rudi is saying, is to change your paradigm, because your paradigm is really built on beliefs. Like, men wear men's clothing, women wear women's clothing, I'm a man, I only wear men's clothing. Like, there's all these codes, and codes are like mathematical equations. 1 + 1 = 2, 2 + 2 = 4. And eventually we create our world or our paradigm based on these codes. And the reason we're having our reality show up, I know you know this is just for the listeners. Sorry.
No,
the reason we're having our world show up the same again and again, or deeper and deeper into the same shit sometimes, is just because we're doubling down on the same codes. And as we say, you have to change a belief or an experience to change a code. That's kind of what builds them. And you can either change the belief or change the experience. But to disbelieve, and this is what people miss, it's actually the same process but in reverse.
Yeah.
It's the same process in reverse. So you go find what you think you are right about, and you literally seek evidence to prove it the other way. So by going and wearing, to point this out in a real way, Rudi's worn the pants, wasn't socially rejected, isn't a social pariah, doesn't have his world fall around. He goes, oh, and it's only a little bit though. It's like, oh, but maybe that was lucky. Like, we start to kind of second guess again. But if you do it again and again, and you've all had this experience, maybe it might have literally been with asparagus. You had it once, and I'm talking about, get this really simply. You're doing it every day in many ways. Maybe you have asparagus, you go, oh, it's not disgusting. I thought it was disgusting. Oh, but it must just be the way they made it. But then maybe you have it a different way. You're like, oh, I like it. And after a few, you're like, I like asparagus. And after a few, you're like, I can wear women's wear.
Yeah.
So that's obviously where you got to, because I know you probably have almost, if not more, activewear than me, and that is saying something. Oh, yes. So what next, Rudi?
Yeah, so that was an interesting experience, because it was like, I realized that I actually preferred that style of dress. And also at the club, because you had a predominantly female membership, even though it was never marketed that way. It was just interesting that that's how it was. And and I became very envious of some of their outfits and activewear. So, and that's where the collection kind of started. But so there was this process where I was realizing, okay, so it's just activewear, right? And then I realized more and more that actually no, it's not just activewear. And realizing, things like on reflection, just realizing that, for example, then a lot of the that casual wear as well. So clothes were like an early kind of indicator or revelation to me that maybe I was not, at a very deep level, maybe I wasn't the person I always
Yeah,
thought that I was.
Let's circle back around, but let's also maybe dive a little deeper for the listener. So the clothing was the first start. The weight loss really, was the catalyst, I suppose, because the body changed. And then the clothing, and then you start to do this inquiry, and you're allowing yourself to have these thoughts. And then it starts to go, well, maybe I like more. And I, not to jump ahead, but I remember when you started wearing nail polish.
Yeah.
So I, as someone from the outside watching, I was always like, okay, well, that's interesting. I know that's a new thing. And then we'd already had sessions, so I had some awareness, but still, your journey is your journey, and it's unfolding for you in real time. So the question I want to ask you is, when you say this was like the earliest inkling, or this was the first, awareness of what?
So so maybe I'll kind of sidestep for a moment into kind of maybe some theory, or so I think there are a few things in our society that we kind of collapse down and kind of mix together. I think you used to call it a collapsed domain. I still don't know if you still use that language.
Yeah.
But so, for example, there are three notions in particular that we think of as deeply intertwined, and a lot of us probably just assume that they're the same thing. So they are biological sex, whatever that means. That's a problematic term anyway. But we generally assume there to be, for humans, two biological sexes, and they're very distinct and very obvious. We assume that gender, or if you want to use a slightly older term, gender identity or gender role, but is the same, that there are two of these and that they map directly onto biological sex. And then sexuality as well, so who we are attracted to romantically and or sexually, and you can separate those as well, but for simplicity here, let's talk about that as one thing. And so generally we assume somebody has a male body, that they will fulfill and act and behave in a male gender role, and that they will almost certainly be attracted to women and only women.
Yes.
So, and conversely, so female attracted exclusively to men. Although we know that these two things are not quite analogous. Like even in saying that, right? So our society is much more tolerant of women who are attracted to women than men who are attracted to men.
That's interesting.
In general,
is that true?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. I think so.
I don't know the stats on it. I know for me, same-sex attraction, I would think would be equal. Just in the top of my head, I would think there would be the same number or the same acceptance.
I don't think so. But
okay. So that's where I get to go, okay, I didn't know that. Yeah.
But even then, in terms of gender role and gender expression, so even if we take the obvious example of clothing, in general, a woman can walk into into the menswear section of a department store like Maya, and basically could walk out wearing just about anything in that, and nobody is going to even blink an eye. It's not even going to be even noticeable a lot of the time. Whereas flip it over, men shopping in the women's wear section of a department store, it's much more. So basically, in what we've got right now in our society, what it's acceptable for a man to wear is this subset of what a woman can wear. A woman can wear all of these things. Men can only wear that bit. So, and we assume that anyway. That there are these sort of one-to-one correlations, and we also assume that those categories are rigid and do not.
That they're binary.
They're binary. That they don't blend over.
I think this is a really beautiful way, Rudi, if I can just give that as a reflection of the simplification of what has become a really complex, very fiery place to dip your toes. And I'm really glad we're having this conversation because, you know me, I'm a stand for sovereignty and I'm a stand for wholeness. And yet what I notice in the current climate online is that if you misstep with language or you misstep with the rules of particularly those fighting for a minority. Let's just put it that way. And I'm actually speaking more to cultural at the moment rather than gender, just because I came under fire last year for a silly mistake I made. It's very unforgiving, and as a result of that unforgivingness and rigidity in those who think they are more educated in the space, there's a lack of trickling down of education, which of course doesn't help the cause overall. So my thing is compassionately hold space for people who misstep, to educate them. And what I love about what you've said there, and this is, I mean, as you're listening, does this not just kind of simplify the whole gender conversation, which again, it's not really gender. We've got biology, which, as you say, yes, classically we would say certain things showing up, external genitalia, penis, etc., certain levels of hormones would be biologically male, maybe internally, vagina, clitoris, certain glands, etc., maybe female. And yet, what a lot of people don't realize is there's actually a spectrum of biology, and that it doesn't always come out like, oh, I'm 100% in this camp and I'm 100% in this camp. There's actually a large, certainly a relevant statistic that varies and is a combination or not either any of the two camps. But again, not discussed. Love that, biology. And then gender is an interesting one because I feel it's the one that we are seeing the greatest growth and I suppose rainbow is a great reference there, because we are seeing the spectrum start to sprout. And I think, on from that you said, and then we've got gender and then sexuality. Yeah. So gender is, what do I identify as? And that is a whole other conversation piece, but I think we're at least having people recognize I identify as having a male body, but I identify as being a female. Like we can have people that it's not necessarily based on biology, but they might accept a certain biology, but under the gender conversation, they're stepping outside of the classical lineage, as you mentioned it before, being vertically stacked. And then, of course, the sexuality piece. I think maybe even sexuality is the piece we're most comfortable with. Are you attracted to same sex or different sex? But then that's stacked on top of what do I even identify as a sex? And then that's stacked on top of what is my body even? What do I just, And so I think I just love that hierarchy of points, or those three containers, because much like anything, now we've got an infinite number of unique nuances based on how we divvy up any one of those containers, is my point. But it can also help to bring the conversation down into one of those conversation pieces. So can I ask you, on a biological level, what do you identify as?
So biologically, I am male.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
And
born as a male.
As a male, raised as a male. But
I guess identified biologically as a male.
Yeah, well, and I guess the other interesting thing about that, I'm really glad that you mentioned intersex before, because there are people who are, have a wide variety of different physical anatomies, but also even cellular and chromosomal makeups. And sometimes people get surprised, because at some point in their life they're brought into contact with the medical field. And realize that they're not as typical as they thought they were. And so all of this stuff is not as black and white as any of us were raised.
It's all in the grey, isn't it? Yeah.
There's a lot of grey areas. And the same applies if we go then to sexuality, because you're right. I think that one, I wouldn't say that battle has been fought and won. There's still a long way to go, but I think there's a more general awareness now that people can be attracted to the same biological sex as themselves, or can be attracted to any and all biological sexes. And you often see that bisexual people are often still feel stigmatized, sometimes both by the straight and gay communities, because they genuinely do not have,
because they didn't pick a side, Rudi.
They're
on the
They didn't
fence.
pick a
We
side.
want you to pick a side, because we're in a society that likes division. I mean, and not because we're evil, but because when we stand on one side, we can be right, and in rightness we find safety. So agreed. That's an interesting perspective, isn't it? Because to a heteronormative that is already seeing potentially homosexuality is like, oh, that's different. They're out there. The bis are with them anyway. But from as you say, a homosexual standpoint, someone who is bi or fluid is a whole other perspective. And so it kind of makes me laugh at that point. It's like, can we just stop? Can we just stop
and
judging
the fluidity
each other?
is important too, right? And that comes, even in our identities more generally, the idea that, oh, look, I am this, and well, are you? And if that was true yesterday, is it true today?
Yes.
Does it have to be true today? And so again, people whose sexuality may be fluid and changing, that's valid as well, right? That's there.
Yeah, and I think
Experience.
I would say my reflection on this, having many years ago, even before it became, I would say, more open in the media, let's say, one of my close family members had a very good friend full transition, and he was shocked. You could just see it had been his best friend. He had identified him as being a boy, and that's who he had been, and then he, in the space of a very short period of time, but completely transitioned, and just noticing how triggered my family member was. And I said, do you not think for a second though? He's like, oh, he's lost his mind. I said, but think about the amount of stigma, think about the amount of rejection, think about the amount of pressure, think about the amount of judgment. Do you not think that there is a deep soul scream, like a deep knowing in him that this is his truth, for him to be so willing to lose you as a friend, potentially his job, all of these things? And the trigger was, if he does that, I don't know if I'm safe in my own sexuality. And I think that's the big issue for a lot of people. It's like, I think I'm a male, and if he thought he was a male and now he's not a male, do I even know who I am? And this is why we get triggered by people making big transitions, because it forces, or it triggers the part of us that doesn't want to shake what we most require for safety, which is identity coherence. But as you are aptly sharing, and as I like to share too, the more agile we become in all of our beliefs, actually the safer we are, because now we're not hooked, tethered, and tied to one rock. Now we have the ability to rock hop and be fully liberated and free. But one of the things you just said, and I wanted to piggyback on it, when we say I am a woman, for instance, or I am a man, or I am trans, or any of these labels do limit us, but they also sometimes give us permission. So it's a bit of everything's a double-edged sword. Everything's the duality of good, bad, shadow, light, right? And I want to just let everyone know who is saying, well, yes, I do know. Right? Yes, I do know. It's a fair argument to say, if you were born and you, at birth, when they slapped your bum and made you cry, and you happened to have a willy or a penis, or you had a vulva, and they just said boy, girl, from that moment, the world, the entirety of the world, the entirety of every human around you, as well as the marketing companies, as well as the kindergartens, as well as the churches, as well as every aspect of society, treated you subconsciously, mind you, and potentially consciously, through a particular narrative. Now, there are definitely studies that definitely also show that on a genetic level, we have predispositions based on hormonal balances, and there are those studies. But when it comes to conditioning, please do not forget that you only believe what you believe about you because you picked up those beliefs and that conditioning from the people around you. And one of the things you said, Rudi, which I think is just such it's so fabulous for me to hear, because I work heavily in the space of women and womanhood. And, one of the funny aspects that we dive into a lot is this feminist push, and how really we kind of screwed ourselves with it in many regards. Lots of things were gained, certainly equality, but there was this desire to be everything, that came with that. Well, I can be a man as well as a woman. And so, like you rightly say, back in the 50s, a woman, or back whenever, that woman couldn't wear pants. Back in Joan of Arc time, she literally, that's what she got burned on the cross for wearing men's clothing. So it is not something that used to exist, but we did such a rage for equality that we absolutely can walk into a men's store, buy men's jumpers, buy men's pants. And so I think what's happened is women have pushed hard against the stereotypical in that space. And yet there is this, perhaps, whether it's the patriarchy, whether it's women as well, this desire to keep men tightly bound, because part of us wonders if that foundation of our nuclear reality, as a nuclear family reality, dissolves, it would be chaos, like what would happen? I don't know. It's an interesting thing to hear you say that, because I was like, yeah, that's a fair point. Men absolutely can go, but it would be with more like, oh, what's that about? More criticism, more judgment. Yeah, and I have to even put my hand up and say, years ago, I remember seeing the first, I think it was a Mac ad in an airport that for makeup for men. And I remember being like, oh, stop already. Like, I was like, stop. I don't want men. And it was more from a place of, I don't want men to be, because I do identify as a woman. I do identify as a woman who is attracted to men. And I'm attracted to men because they're different, right? It's that polarity. I like that they have rough skin. I like that they look stupidly attractive without anything, and I don't want them to look like me. So it was more from that place, but there was this part of me that's like, just stop already, because I don't want men to be more like women. But obviously in that place, the men who feel like men will stay men, and that marketing won't appeal to them. But right. At this time, of course, I'm just really owning that came up for me too. So I think we all get to acknowledge that we are conditioned to like what we like and think we know what we know. And yet, what I love about what you're sharing, Rudi, is when we don't, we might be surprised at what comes up. Because you absolutely identified as a male, a techie nerd male, married, children, all the things. Then you had your weight loss journey. And if it's okay with you,
yes,
would you mind if I share an aha that I know we had in a coaching session, which I found was interesting, because obviously you would come and, people come for coaching ultimately because they want something they don't have, in a nutshell. There's something outside of their current paradigm. They're like, whether it's a feeling or an experience or frustration. And we were exploring at that time why, even though you had achieved this goal, I don't know if you remember this particular session, but you were like, why? I'm not happy. In fact, I feel sick when I look in the mirror. Yeah. And we unpacked it a little bit, and we got right down to the root cause of it. And it was because you had looked so athletic. You said, I have muscles. And you were very into, and this might surprise the listeners, yes, you did the running, yes, you did the riding, but you actually fell in love with ballet.
Yeah.
You fell in love with ballet. And that was like an interesting thing for me to observe. And, obviously I had, like I say, I'm like, okay, I'm curious to see where this unfolds. But it's like, we'll wait and see, because Rudi's still processing it. But in that session, I remember that you unpacked that you had associated muscular, strong men energy with bullies, because they had been the kids who had bullied you at school. And now in your subconscious, you had become this muscular, athletic human. And now there was almost a rejection of self, because you were identifying yourself as this masculine energy. And so I kind of want to, and in other work we had done, there was an awareness that an energy of disliking men in general through the coding of your family and whatnot. So we won't go into that. But I'm just curious. We talked about you biologically resonate as being a man. I'm curious on the gender level, what do you identify as?
So I call myself non-binary, simply because that's the available label, and everything you said earlier about the power and the dangers of labels is absolutely true. So, but the interesting thing is, I was talking before about how we have this choice of 2 and only 2 biological sexes, 2 and only 2 genders that map neatly onto them, 2 and only 2 sexualities that stack on top of those. But we know that that's a cultural construction, because not all societies organize themselves that way.
Yes.
So we have these 2 buckets called gender, or gender roles, and what goes into them: clothing, behaviors, interests and hobbies, ways of being in the world. Like, every time there's a stereotypical comment about women are so emotional, or men are so rational and logical, or what. I mean, these are all. It
makes me so. I just immediately get my back up, and I'm like, don't be ridiculous. Yeah.
All of these things, or right down to boys like blue, girls like pink. And we know that even as recently as about 150 years ago, those two were reversed. So there's nothing intrinsic about these. It's just completely
illusionary, construction. Yeah, that's true.
And as is the idea that there is only 2 of these buckets available. So, and we've sorted just about every personality trait, every interest, every hobby, just about everything is into
the 2 buckets,
in one of 2 buckets.